Cursed be the ground, for our sake. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for us. For out of the ground we were taken, for the dust we are, and to the dust we shall return. The Divine Battlelord is a combination of the Elder Scrolls Crusader and Battlemage classes dedicated to limiting Daedra and its worshippers. Specialized in spellcasting and brute force, the build uses modded spells and abilities that can fight against all sorts of enemies, whether they are mortal or undead. Besides spells, the Divine Battlelord is a tank that can absorb damage and magic attacks thanks to its skills in blocking and heavy armor. Best of all, this build does not require any crafting skills and will rely heavily on temporary buffs to make up for those skills in combat. In addition, this build is also designed for challenging gameplay since it's quite strong, so there will be some gameplay mods recommended to go along. They are profane creatures with no hope or redemption. They lure innocents to their depths, corrupt the souls of all they touch, and their heretical artifacts grant powers to mortals that wreak havoc across Tamriel. They must be destroyed or guarded to prevent temptation. That's where you come in, Child of Stendarr, Hammer of Ebonarm. Seek out those that do harm, and send them back to oblivion. For the character, we'll start with Breton. With Imperious, Bretons have a 15% Magicka resistance ability and will also gain 25% spell absorption when Magicka is at 25% or less. This will benefit against fighting enemies since the build will start by casting spells and then resort to melee when Magicka is depleted. With Bretons, there's also a side quest to obtain the Grail of Bethany. While in possession, you'll be able to regenerate Magicka and stamina faster, but you need to defeat a hostile NPC to acquire it. Another ability is the Stones of Galen, which grants an additional effect for each active standing stone, but for this build it's not really important. The Lord will be our standing stone. With Andromeda, the Lord will grant the build more powerful power attacks, including the ability to power attack without stamina. The drawback, however, is that during combat, stamina will deplete and you'll be unable to regenerate. Andromeda also includes a once per day power for each standing stone. For the Lord, kneel or be knelt causes all nearby enemies to be thrown onto the ground for a certain time period and will allow our character to regenerate stamina in the process. Wintersun introduces a new mechanic allowing the player to worship a deity, and doing so will gain new abilities. Due to the character's backstory, we'll be worshipping Ebonarm. Following Ebonarm gives us more damage against Daedra, and the Shrine Blessing increases our heavy armor rating. However, for the Shrine Blessing, we'll be switching to Stendarr, but more on that later. Remaining faithful to Ebonarm long enough and you'll be awarded the Raven's Harvest ability after hitting devotee status. Raven's Harvest reduces enemies' armor rating and you gain that amount in the process, which makes up for the lack of crafting skills. This ability also doubles against Daedra, so fighting them is a piece of cake. Forgotten Magic Redone is a spell mod which will consist of our main arsenal. The spells of choice will mainly be located in the Paladin category along with another in Pyromancer. The main spell will be Hammer of Justice, a conjured mace that will also serve as our main weapon. These spells grant you experience points that can be leveled up and reward you with a point, which can be spent on upgrades. Since the build doesn't use any fortified one-handed enchantments, you want to focus on damage upgrades like Light's Hammer and Stalwart Protector. You also want to grab Exorcist and Crusader since most of the enemies you'll be fighting will be against the Undead and Daedra. Lastly, there's Faithful Avenger, which will be used in conjunction with Holy Bolt, but more on that later. Divine Armor will be our protection spell to make up for the lack of resistances gained from crafting. In addition to reducing spell damage, you want to grab Armor of Faith to increase armor rating and Divine Insight for spell cost reduction. Other upgrades to consider is Beacon of Light, Divine Vengeance, and Last Hope. Divine Light will be our healing spell of choice. Upgrades will include Divine Aegis, Blessed Aegis, and Pain Suppression that will help reduce all sorts of damage for a short period of time, ensuring survivability in combat. While this spell only heals for 40 points, it will be amplified later on when acquiring perks from the skill tree. In the Pyromancer section, the main offensive spell is Conflagrate. For its upgrades, the first one to grab is Ignite, which applies a damage over time effect for 5 seconds. Afterwards, you want to grab Ember Storm, Molten Fury, Flame Strike, and Blazing Tempest, which all contribute to increasing the spell's damage against the targets. Another spell is Holy Bolt, which can be used to damage foes or heal allies. Although a utility spell, I focus on upgrades like Banish and Healer's Wrath that damage enemies, since a large majority of my playthrough was without a follower. An important upgrade to choose is Divine Avenger, which greatly increases the Holy Bolt's damage against the target, but will result in a cooldown. However, with the Faithful Avenger upgrade and the Hammer of Justice, once you kill an enemy with your mace, the cooldown will no longer be in effect, so you can use Holy Bolt right away on the next target. I should also mention Blessed Weapon, which summons a Divine Battle Axe. While this spell is incredibly helpful, especially when outnumbered, I didn't use it very much and only grabbed one upgrade. I also find it quite overpowered since the weapon is invincible and there's no way to damage it from enemies. Another spell mod to complement the build is from Apocalypse, which adds new spells into the world of Skyrim. A very handy and convenient spell is Okada's Recital, which stores up to 3 spells that will activate when entering combat. Using it to store Divine Armor will save you from casting it at the start of combat, freeing up some magicka to cast your offensive spells. Tree Wounds gives you a temporary health boost, and when you factor in all the perks that amplify the restoration skills, this can double your health during late game. You can also use this with Okada's Recital to store the spell. Spell Torrent is another utility spell that links magical effects with 3 chosen spells. Basically, I use it to link spell reduction costs for offensive spells like Conflagrate and Holy Bolt, and then Divine Armor for better healing. Lastly, there's Incendiary Flow, a powerful add-on level spell which creates a molten stream of lava for 10 seconds. This can be used just before you engage in melee combat where enemies' health deteriorate rather quickly. As for vanilla spells, you want to include Stendarr's Aura, Turn Undead, Circle of Protection, and Wall of Flames. All effective spells against the undead. Since this character is intended to be Dragonborn, you want to include the shouts Unrelenting Force, Become Ethereal, and Fire Breath. Now for the perks, which will be covered in the Ordinator mod. Ordinator overhauls the skill tree, making the selected perks more useful and unique to fit the Divine Battlelord's playstyle. In Restoration, one of the major perks is Mage Ward, which when casting a spell creates a ward in front of your character, protecting you from magic attacks. Like any other ward spells, this also protects you from Draugr shots and Dragon Breath while waiting on the opportunity to cast your offensive spell. Other perks to acquire are specialized against the undead, including Halberto, Exorcist, and Crusader's Fire. Crusader's Fire will make your turn undead spells to inflict damage over time effects onto the targets, while Exorcist will add new spells to your arsenal. Though to be honest, I only use Stellar's Core, which hurls a giant sunfire ball to create a devastating AoE blast that can instantly wipe out lower level enemies. The next two perks are important in regards to the Lord Stone. I mentioned how the Lord Stone drains stamina and you'll be unable to regenerate it in combat, but with the Warrior's Flame perk you receive a temporary boost to rapidly regenerate it along with your magicka. Another important perk is Gods and Mortals. While having an active Shrine Blessing, which will in this case be Standard, each time you block an attack you will receive 25 points of stamina and also stagger the target. Both perks I find are very vital, since fighting enemies without any stamina will make things much harder. In the one-handed skill tree, maces are specialized in fighting the undead as well as doing massive damage from power attacks. Besides Furious Strength, Smite enables a critical strike that does up to 8 times the damage against the undead. However, the Toll the Bell perk is where you can really inflict some major damage. Performing a sideways power attack drains all your stamina but does devastating damage to the target that when you factor in the previous perks you can wipe out all their health in a single strike. However, this attack should be used smartly because you don't want to end up fighting multiple enemies when your stamina is drained. Another major skill tree is Block, which features the Time Block perk. Blocking an attack within 1 second of raising your shield will stagger the target, and if you include the Poke the Dragon perk you inflict more damage from your mace. Quick Reflexes is basically the same as the vanilla perk, but this will be used alongside Cast Aside. When performing a Power Bash, the Cast Aside perk will knock the target to the ground, giving you a great opportunity to finish them off. This also works on giants as well, and it's really fun to pull off that you're sending your enemies flying. In the heavy armor skill tree, you want to focus on the right side of the branch since the perks will help reduce damage as well as increase your armor rating. In addition, Revel in Battle will help increase your melee damage if enemies attack you, and Out in the Inferno will reduce magic attacks if you get struck by them. Since part of the build requires wielding a weapon in one hand and a spell in another, you'll want to invest in the Spellblade perks in the Alteration tree. These will simply make your spells more effective as long as you're holding the mace in the other hand. More importantly, however, is the Waylock Dormant Arcana perk that links 3 magic effects to the chosen spell type. For the spell type, we'll go with Armor, which will be the Divine Armor spell, and the magic effects will include melee damage, armor rating, and spell absorption. Lastly, there's Wild Shrines. This perk places 5 shrines around Skyrim dedicated to each school. Finding and activating each shrine will grant more effective spells for the chosen school. Rounding out the last of the skill trees are Destruction and Conjuration. Both are meant to reduce the magicka cost of the school spells along with the Mystic Binding perk. Other than that, there aren't much of a priority since the upgrades from Forguarded Magic will help with your Conjured Mace and Conflagrate spell. Though I would invest some perks in the Fire Branch so that your Fire Breath Shout can do more damage. Besides the required mods, this build is meant to play with some gameplay mods to make it more challenging since the build is quite powerful. Otherwise, without them, the game will be too easy, especially on legendary difficulty. The mods listed are what I use for testing the gameplay, and they're recommended to keep it challenging, but can still be played on a higher difficulty setting. For combat, I use Wildcat and Ultimate Combat to improve the enemy AI, making them smarter and more aggressive. I also added mortal enemies in TK Dodge, since both are pretty much mandatory with the combat mods. For enemies, I included Organized Bandits of Skyrim, which not only adds more variety to enemies, but forces the player to be more strategic when approaching them. I also included Draugr upgrades and improvement, which is similar to Organized Bandits, but of course tailored to Draugrs. Another mod for enemies is Enemy Evolution or Revolution of Skyrim. This mod adds spells, perks, and items to enemies that are usually exclusive to the player. It also provides support for modded spells, so you can include Forgotten Magic and Apocalypse when installing. Lastly, there's Arena and Encounter Zone Overhaul, which will increase the difficulty in Skyrim's encounter zones. With all these mods, expect combat to be at least challenging from early to late game. Although not required, they make almost all the enemies more dangerous than the vanilla game, but not as hardcore as like Revenge of the Enemies. Now on to the exciting stuff, the special moves. Each of these special moves will help enhance the gameplay of the build, as well as maximize the amount of damage you can make in combat. The first move I call is Consecrated Force, which requires the spells Dream Winds and Holy Bolt. With a Divine Avenger upgrade, Holy Bolt's damage is dependent on the character's HP. With Dream Winds nearly doubling the health pool, Holy Bolt can deal an absurd amount of damage that can easily kill lower level enemies, or evaporate a large portion of the target's health. If you're using Dream Winds with Okai's Recital, then Holy Bolt is pretty much the first spell you want to use in combat. Remember to finish them off with your mace so you can neglect the cooldown as well. The next move is called Crushing Hammer Ebonarm, which requires the time block and poke the dragon perk, and then performing a sideways power attack. This move is basically maximizing the amount of physical damage you can do to an opponent. Performing a time block will give you enough time to follow up with a sideways power attack that can do an insane amount of damage when you factor in all the required perks. Though this should be used for one-on-one combat, since performing this move will wipe out all your stamina. Inferno Pursue is basically using the turn undead spells on an opponent, bashing them and then casting Wall of Flames. While the turn undead spells are useful for crowd control, it can be quite frustrating to chase down an enemy. However, you can simply bash them with a shield or use a shout to stagger them, while casting Wall of Flames as their health deteriorates. If you feel you don't have enough magicka, then you can conjure your mace to finish them off the old-fashioned way. The last one, Wrath of the Gods, is probably my favorite to execute. I mentioned before how you can take advantage of the Quick Reflexes perk to perform a power bash to knock the target to the ground. After doing so, use the Incendiary Flow spell and then follow up with your Fire Breath shout. Other than being fun to pull off, the amount of fire damage this does is quite high and it just feels awesome to finish off any enemy this way. Strategy-wise, you want to have your Conjured Mace and Divine Armor active before each and every fight. Depending on when you encounter enemies, your other hand will either be a spell or shield. Approaching enemies, you want to repeatedly cast Conflagrate until they get within melee range, or use Holy Bolt on higher level enemies. Then rely on your time block skills to stagger them, and then finish them off with your mace. I should also mention the Descending Light perk from the Restoration skill tree, which rapidly regenerates magicka at the start of combat, so you can start off with higher level spells like Stellar Core and Circle Protection when fighting the undead. For mages and Draugrs that use shouts, you can also advance on them by holding out to your spell thanks to the Mage Word to protect you from attacks. Mage Word can also protect you from Dragon's Breath, but when fighting them on the ground, be prepared to use the Become Ethereal shout when equipping your shield. With the combat mods installed, you'll notice that enemies will almost always block your attacks. However, a simple Floose or Yule will stagger them, giving you an opportunity for some free hits.
This is the end for you.
Role-playing wise, while this build is meant to specialize fighting against Daedra, you rarely encounter one during the playthrough. However, there are many Daedric worshippers like vampires, mages, and the Forsworn that should be wiped out, and in doing so will limit Daedric influence in Skyrim. You can also take this a step further by completing the Daedric quest by banishing their artifacts into oblivion, or acquiring and safeguarding them to diminish their influence. Just remember to tell them to stuff it if you're acquiring the artifact.
Spare me your pitiful pride.
As for the major quests, you want to complete all 3. Dawnguard and Dragonborn because of the Daedric presence involved, as well as the main quest to stop Alduin from destroying the world. For factions, joining the companions is required to obtain the Firewall Shield, but avoid becoming a werewolf. Joining the College of Winterhold will be required to access higher level spells, and you want to stop Arcano from controlling the Eye of Magnus. Obviously, you won't be joining the Thieves Guild or Dark Brotherhood, but instead wipe out the Assassin Guild for their treachery. Well, there you have it. Feel free to comment on the build or the video in general. I've also added a link to the perk spread in the description under the required mods. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Peace out.